Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you today, a tag that I didn't get to yesterday on Tag Tuesday. I originally planned to do two tags yesterday and ran out of time. As hard as that is to believe, considering that all I do is write here on the fainting couch, I ran out of time to do any tags on Tag Tuesday. And I'd originally planned on doing both of them today, but I think I'm going to run out of time again. So I'm going to do one of them now and see if I have time for the other. And this is the personal library tag, which didn't start out as a tag. It started out as just a discussion on Shelly Swearingen's channel about your personal library, what it means to you, what it is, how it changes. And that's a familiar subject. It's come up on this channel many times. But I think it's important for those of us who make BookTube videos to remember that we have new people finding us all the time, and they're not always going to go trekking through all of our backlog, especially a backlog as big as mine. That's just not going to happen. So it's worthwhile to go over the basics, regularly, so that people are encountering that new, are finding it instead of needing to go hunting for it. I've talked about my personal library quite a bit on this channel, but always happy to do it again. And I saw this as a tag on Michael K Vaughan's channel. I'll leave a link to his channel. I'll leave a link to Shelly Swearingen's channel, where you tune in and she leans over the parapet, looks down into the thoroughfare and says, "You do not want to be staring like that at me." Or maybe that was Al Swearingen from Deadwood. It's hard to tell them apart, what with all the obscenities. but anyway, all of the questions here have to do with your personal connection, your personal collection of books, your personal library. And the first one is: do you have books around you, or do you think of yourself as having a personal library? I don't know of many people who would answer this with the first option. I have a personal library. Of course I do. I've got books on shelves. I take care of them. They are semi-organized. I use them. I occasionally give them out to other people. Other people can browse the shelves. If that doesn't make it a personal library, I don't know what does. Now, no, it's not that I just have books around. If you want an example of someone who has just books lying around, maybe for aesthetic effect, but certainly never uses them as a personal library, what you need to do is look for any booktuber with more than 50,000 subscribers. If you anyone with 60, 70, 80, 100,000 subscribers on a platform dedicated to the love of books, then you're guaranteed to be looking at someone who never reads, never at all, never under any circumstances. Maybe a short form summary or a Blinkist summary, but not the books that are artfully arranged with fairy lights in their background. If you want to see that, books just lying around, then you're going to have to go to a different part of BookTube, I think. Then the next question is: what does a collection or a personal library mean to you? And I think I see what Shelley's getting at here, because even in our little corner of BookTube, there is a distinction to be made. Some of us are book collectors. Really collectors, where it's not the same thing as, oh, I like that particular cover of a ratty mass market paperback better than I like another cover of the same ratty mass market paperback, but actual collectors, people who are looking for books that will appreciate over time, rare editions, first editions, signed editions, that sort of thing. That is the sort of thing that I think of more as a collection than a personal library. I very much have a personal library. It is dog-eared and ratty and heterogeneous, so that you look at it and you very much get the feeling that a reader is using this library, not assembling something behind anti-ultraviolet glass for collecting purposes. I know book people who do that. I know book people who do both. One of my oldest friends has a very large book, what I would call and what he would call a book collection. But he also has a large personal library. They aren't the same, and they aren't anywhere near each other. but he has both. So I think they're very distinct in my mind. Then the next question is: what is your personal library for? A great question. I've been fascinated to look at some of the answers. The standard answers here would be either for reference or for enjoyment. And I hesitate when I make those answers now, because a huge amount of both of those purposes have been shifted to online, have been shifted to a plate of metal and glass that weighs a pound and that has as many books on it as I have in print and paper and paste on bookshelves around me. Far, far easier for research. An e-book library is far easier to research, but also it has endless amounts of enjoyment. So, I mean, there are other answers that you could give. Comfort, for instance. Bill Rutenberg mentioned that sometimes when he's feeling really burned out or tired, and maybe a little too tired at the moment to read, he will just sit there and look at his books, and it's a comforting feeling. And that's true. There's nothing shallow about that. I bet that's true for everybody that's listening to me. That is true, and I sometimes do that. Not because I'm feeling too tired. I'm not as old as Bill is, so I don't ever feel that way. But sometimes it's the aesthetics, and I worry about that. I worry that it has in the last 10 years become mostly aesthetic. And that would be very bad. That would call for a soup to nuts wholesale revision of what it is to have a library in printed book form. Because that's a lot of weight on the floor, Joyce. That's a lot of work and a lot of tedium and a lot of boxing and moving on moving day for aesthetics. That's way too much of that. It's entirely wasteful. And a little bit on the greedy side, since there are people who would actually want these books, who don't want an e-library. But right now, anyway, I will stick with my tried and true answer, which is it's for enjoyment and it's for research. Then the next question is, where is your personal library? Contained to a single room or spread out all over the house? Mine is spread out over a few rooms. And again, the more I think about it, I've had this thought for years, but it was the pandemic that actually solidified in my mind and enhanced how much I love my e-book collections on various devices, whether it's a couple of hundred on an e-ink screen Nook or a Kindle, or a few thousand on an iPad, or many iPads, and also backed up on a little USB drive. So they aren't going anywhere, and it's EPUB. Almost all of what I have is EPUB, which is a very open software format, very open. There isn't going to be any technology, any common popular technology of tablet or laptop variety in the future that can't read EPUB. That just isn't going to happen. So, I mean, the way EPUB is built, the way it's coded, you would be excluding a huge amount of other stuff. So it will always be available. It'll always be readable by whatever device that I have. And when I think about that, and when I think about how much time I spend reading on my iPad, researching on my iPad, annotating, working on my iPad with the library that's on my iPad. I have libraries duplicated on a number of iPads and on a thumb drive. When I think about that, then I start to ask questions about why the book should be in every room, sprawling all over the place. Here, I have a little book room that is, one of the walls has a window smack dab in the middle of it, and it's a small space. So that's that whole wall. Then there are 3 other walls that are lined with bookcases, floor to ceiling. I very often think in the last few years, but especially since the pandemic, especially since 2020, I have often thought that space is big enough for all the books that I would ever want, that are in print, that are in paper and paste and hardboard covers, as opposed to ebooks, which don't take up any space at all, and which I can have in any multitude that I want, anywhere I want. That is surely space enough for that, which would put the rest of the books here squarely in the crosshairs. How long are they going to last? And what would happen if I had e-copies of every single one of them? I mean, that won't happen. There are quite a few that aren't in e-copies. But right now, anyway, the answer to the question, I guess what I'm trying to say is that my answer to a lot of these things is provisional. But right now, the books sprawl in a number of different rooms. Let's see. The next question is, how many books make up your personal library? I would say about 4,000 printed books and another 4,000 or 5,000 ebooks scattered over a few different devices. Scattered over my libraries are not exactly the same on any one device, which is kind of maddening and actually needs to be fixed. But for a total of, I would say, probably the ballpark is around 10,000 books. But fewer than half of those are remaining are print analog books. Then let's see here. The next question is, how do you organize your personal library? Again, my ebook library is easy to organize, simple to do. You just, no matter what device you're using, whether it's a Kobo app or the Kindle app or the Barnes & Noble Nook app is very convenient, or a million free ebook library reader apps that you can get on any app store in the world. No matter what device, no matter what means I'm using, they all offer you ways to organize your library that are as easy as just moving files around with your finger. So, like for instance, take the Nook app. I can make shelves, virtual shelves, and just fill them with certain subject matters. And I can make as many as I want. The same book can be in 10 different shelves. Right? So Larry McMurtry could be in Westerns, it could be in American fiction, it could be just in a Larry McMurtry collection. It doesn't matter. They're all roots to the same EPUB. Very much not true when I'm organizing the print books around here. And I still do try to do that. I've got whole bookcases of biography, and there's nothing else on those bookcases but biography. I've got whole bookcases of history. I've got one whole bookcase of mass market paperbacks. I've got 2 whole shelves of graphic novels. And I've got a huge floor-to-ceiling bookcase that is stuffed with book essays, books about books, prefaces, book reviews, that literary criticism, that sort of thing. There's a whole bookcase of that, and that stuff, examples of that aren't anywhere else. The only place, ironically enough, where I don't really do a whole lot of organizing is my little book room. All the Penguin Classics are together in there. All the Signet Classics are together in there. But most of the books in there are not organized at all, and I like it that way. I like the feeling of that. Let's see. The next question is, do you keep track of your personal library? If so, how? I have many times over the years in many different ways. For a long, long time, I had a book. That's what I called it, was a book. It was a big written journal type thing where I jotted down every book that I got, how much I paid for it, where I got it, when I got it, what format it was, and all the details about it. And every single book had one of those entries. And if I was being conscientious and I got rid of a book, I would go back to its entry, no matter how many pages back it was, and lightly draw diagonal lines through it. So I could still read the entry, but the diagonal lines were meant to tell me that that is no longer part of my collection. And I would do that every time I got new books. I would add them to that book. And I grew disoriented. I grew disillusioned with it because I never looked at it. I never went back and used it at all. And that struck me as wasteful. It struck me as really weirdly wasteful. So I stopped doing that. And then years later, when I discovered BookTube, Sam at Sam's Nonsense, used to have a BookTube channel, wonderful, wonderful BookTube channel. She offered to make me a spreadsheet. Suddenly, Olive's ears perked up. She made me a spreadsheet, and she sent it to me and said, I use this all the time. I bet it'll be helpful to you. I hope that it will be. And it was gibberish to me. It was like reading a technical journal in Klingon. So I wrote back to her and said, when I say that I want that a spreadsheet for me has to be foolproof, I mean it literally. It really has to be children's building block simple. And she laughed, and she redid it and sent me a database, a spreadsheet for my books that was dirt simple. And I used that for a long time, and it was really good. She's really talented. It had columns for everything that I would want to enter. They were all changeable, and also, unlike the book journal, there was a little space for reactions, for editorial commentary, and I could go on forever in that space without hurting anything at all. My book didn't have that. But again, I did that for a couple of years and then realized, well, but you haven't looked at this once. Not once in the whole time you've been doing this. Now, I complained about that to friends at the time, and they said, well, no, you wouldn't be looking for it. It's a record. You would make this record and then just leave it. You might consult it once in a blue moon, but you shouldn't be expecting to look back at this the way you do at an old journal entry. Maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe there is. I certainly when I was making a written journal of my books, of the commerce in and out of my books, certainly when I was doing that, I felt more aware, more to grips with the actual process of books in my life. So I have often thought about reviving that practice, about reviving a written book journal where I keep track of things. God knows it would be a lot more advanced now. It would have to be. because the book journal that I had before was during the interval when I was not in book reviewing. I was in book reviewing, for those of you who are new to the channel, I was in book reviewing for a long time, and then I left it to go into retail bookselling for a quarter of a century. And when that was true, I did not have review copies coming from publishers, and there was no such thing as ebooks. Now it would be much harder to do. I would be much more exhaustive, but maybe I would appreciate it. Maybe I would. Maybe I should go back and try that. But anyway, right now, the answer to the question, how do you organize, how do you keep track of your personal library, is that right now I don't at all, which is really bad. Now that I say it, I realize how bad that sounds. That I need to do something. I right now don't keep track of it in any way, and I probably should. So the next question is, how do you decide to add a book to your personal library? For me, there are two rungs. One is all the books that are not in that little book room. And then there are the books in that little book room. For the books that aren't in that little book room, well, publishers often decide to add books to my personal library by sending them to me in the mail. So I get books every day in the mail. For those of you who are new to the channel, I am a book section editor, I am a book columnist, and I am a book reviewer. So I get books from publishers often. Not as often as I did before in the pre-pandemic days when it was a gigantic mail service tub full of packages every single day. But still, every day it happens. That choice is taken out of my hands, and at least briefly, those books are in my personal library. And then there's everything else, right? There's thrift shops, charity shops, and library book sales, and also the used bookstores here in Boston, including the Brattle Bookshop in downtown Boston. So those all add to my personal library. There's always a struggle for shelf space to fill those things, and then from the ranks of those things are pulled the really keeper books, the ones I really like and want, and those go in the little book room. Where there is far less in terms of turnover. The turnover far seldom happens in that room than it does. Those are, I guess you could say, my favorite books. And those are drawn from the books that I get anyway. I very seldom go hunting for favorite books. Instead, I'm just lucky enough to find them. It's just that a lot of people have the same distinction, I imagine all of you do, where you go to a used book warehouse or a thrift shop of some kind, and you find a bunch of books, and of that bunch of books that you find, one or two, maybe one, are real finds. They're things you really like. The only difference that I do here, that same thing is true for me. The only difference here is that the ones that spark that feeling in me, where that I really like them, physically go somewhere else. Then let's see here. When it's time to cull your personal library, how do you decide what stays and what goes? There is a yardstick that I should be using. There are things that I tell myself all the time when it comes to the books in these outer rooms, not the little book room, but when it comes to the books in these outer rooms, I think about yardsticks like this all the time. And some of them, they all make sense, but some of them sound completely pitiless. Like, for instance, the fact that I liked a book is not sufficient reason to keep it. The fact that I reviewed a book is not sufficient reason to keep it. The fact that I might someday need the book is not sufficient reason to keep it. The fact that I like a cover of a book is not sufficient reason to keep it. The fact that I've never seen a second copy of the book that I found is not sufficient reason to keep it. The only sufficient reason to keep a book is because I am going back to it as an active possession of mine. It should not be a collection of fond memories, because they weigh thousands and thousands of pounds. It's hugely wasteful for books to be a collection of fond memories. Do I use those yardsticks? No, I do not. No, I'm looking right now. I'm looking around this room. There's scarcely a book that I'm looking at that would survive if I did. If liking a book, merely liking a book, but only liking it that one time, never going back to it, never loving it, is not sufficient reason to keep a book. Well, that's 1,000 books that I can see right here. It would be gone. Having reviewed a book is not sufficient reason for keeping it. That's another 1,000 that's gone, just like that. Using a book is a reason, but thinking you might use one down the line, you have no use for it now, but you might have a use for it down the line. No. I have thousands of books, thousands of ebooks that aren't going anywhere. I've access to thousands more that I can have literally in 2 seconds if that need crops up. And honestly, how often does that need crop up? I might tell myself, well, I've got a biography of Marcus Aurelius that's 800 pages long from 10 years ago. It's by a biographer that I really like. Have I read it since I reviewed it? No. It's been sitting on the shelf for 10 years without being touched. Okay. And then I also have a biography of Marcus Aurelius from 100 years before that, from the 19th century. And I got that because I was thinking, well, if somebody does a new study of Marcus Aurelius, you're going to want both of them. You're going to want to juxtapose the thoughts and the reactions to Marcus Aurelius from the Victorian book with the one from 10 years ago. If such a study of Marcus Aurelius were to appear new from Oxford University Press or whatever, and I were to get that book and want to review it, would I touch either one of those books? Would I actually use them when the time came? No, I would not. Not only because most editors wouldn't allow me the space that would be necessary to use them, but also because I wouldn't want to. I would want to bear down on the book in front of me. I would almost certainly not do that. And how many times has that happened? How many times does that need to happen before I realize that I'm keeping books for no good reason? So the question touches on a sore spot. If I were to use the yardsticks that I know are true, most of the books that I'm looking at would be gone. And right now, the tall bookcase of books of book reviews, collections of book reviews, is just smiling smugly because it knows that it's beyond touch. I do use those books all the time. I go back all the time to what my critical brethren in centuries past have said, or decades past. So those books are just smug because they know they're not going anywhere. But all the rest of them, anyway, let's see here. The next question is, does your personal library have books you haven't read, may not read? Now, I confess, I don't in any way understand the second question there, so I'm just going to ignore it. But my book collection, my personal library does have books that I haven't read, but almost none. And all on that one bookcase. There's a so-called work bookcase that's all new releases in the American book market. The top shelf is April books. So right next to being extremely current. And then all the lower shelves, month by month, are forthcoming books for this spring and summer. And there are a great number of those that I haven't read because I'm still up to my ham hocks in March books. So there are a whole bunch of April books that I haven't read. There are a whole bunch of March books that I still haven't read. And I barely touched any of the others. But almost everywhere else, no. Which is even worse. In a way, it's even worse. Am I going to ever return to all of those books that I have read that are sitting on the shelf? Am I going to return to them? The ones I return to are in my little book room. Am I going to return to any of these? Maybe one or two here and now. Anyway, the next question is, what do you think about the idea of zero TBR? It'll never be true for me. TBR, for those of you who are new to BookTube, is to be read. It's your working pile. And it'll never be true for me as long as I am putting the remit that I am on what I do. I am consciously choosing that my remit, consciously, it's also my job, but I'm consciously choosing that my remit for reading will be new releases in the American book market in the 15 or 16 genres that I like, that I read myself. So I'm not forcing myself to read genres that I don't like just because they're new releases. But I read fairly widely, and that is my remit for books. And there will always be new books. so that is a TBR that I can't ever get down to zero. I can't ever do that. I wouldn't want to do that. Not only would that be a very bad sign for the American book market, but I'd be out of a job. But as for the rest of it, I'm constantly, like a lot of you, I'm constantly going through the books in the little book room, or books that I get at the Brattle Bookshop or at a thrift shop of some kind. In piles like that, there will be books that I haven't read. I get to them right away. I mix them in. They are the mortar that binds the bricks of all the new books. So zero TBR is not a religious thing with me at all, because it's never going to happen. And then the last question is, how do you feel about your personal library? And I think that's encapsulated by a lot of the answers that I've given so far, which is that I think it's obvious to tell from listening to me that I have a lot of ambivalence about my personal library. I have had this ambivalence for a long time, but it was really sharpened by the pandemic. When I stopped getting so many books in the mail anymore, and for a long time there in early 2020, not only did I stop getting books from publishers, but I stopped being able to go and get secondhand books either. And that really underscored for me how completely happy I am with the library that I have on my iPad. Between the various book forums, between the various readers, I have thousands of books. And there are always more than I could get. And there's always a constant supply of them that are free, which I can't say about analog secondhand books. So it was the pandemic really sharpened for me the fact that I really need to look at my personal library. So some of the answers that I've been hearing to how I feel about my personal library have made me a little bit nostalgic, a little bit envious, because some of those answers have been, I absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. I look at it and I'm so happy with it. Not true with me. I wish it were, but it's not true with me. I look at these books and think, this is wasteful. Is the main thought that I have. I look at them and think, this is wasteful. You have books on these shelves that you have not touched in 10 years. It's not that you've taken them down and read a little bit of them. It's that you haven't touched them in 10 years. Haven't felt the slightest inclination to touch them. And quite a few times in the last 5 years alone, quite a few times, the urge to touch them, the urge to read one of those books on the shelves out here that I'm looking at, quite a few times in the last 5 years, that urge has come upon me, and I have gone to the ebook instead. Not just to the ebook version of that book. Quite a few times that has happened. More times than I could easily rack up. I've thought, I've got a little gap between assignments here, between new releases. I feel like a palate cleanser, and I know what I feel like. I know what I feel like as a palate cleanser. I feel like rereading, let's say, The Night Lives On by Walter Lord, his follow-up to A Night to Remember, his famous best-selling book about the Titanic disaster. He wrote a sequel to that called The Night Lives On. Let's say, by random chance, I feel like reading The Night Lives On, like rereading it, maybe taking new notes on it, that sort of thing. If I felt that, I guarantee you, I would not stir from this fainting couch and go digging around in my old mass market paperbacks that are going to be uncongenial and uncomfortable to read anyway. I guarantee you I wouldn't do that. Instead, the first thing I would do would be to check to see if I have The Night Lives On any in ebook format on any of the venues, the libraries that I have on any of the devices that I have. I have 3 devices within easy reach at all times. If it's not on one of those, I would probably buy it. I would probably buy the ebook for $2 or whatever. Or I would ask around, see if anybody has an ebook of The Night Lives On that they could send me. That is absolutely true. And if that's true, what am I doing with 90% of these books? What am I doing with 90% of these books? What am I doing with a hardcover, a bulky, heavy hardcover of Antonia Fraser's biography of Mary, Queen of Scots? What am I doing with that? When I'm not going, even if I wanted to return to it and study some part of it or even reread the whole of it for pleasure, it's a very good book. I know that I wouldn't do it. I know that I wouldn't pull it off the shelf. I have an ebook of it, or if I don't, I can get one in 5 seconds. Obviously, we're going to finish this tag as we started. Obviously, my own personal feelings about my personal library are in flux, to put it mildly. So I will need to deal with that. Sooner or later, I will need to deal with it. Maybe 2022 will be the year when I deal with that. It's going to take a lot of self-examination, maybe. It would feel very weird for me to live in a space without all these books. That would feel very weird for me. And that takes a little bit of examination. If my personal space has always been surrounded by books, and it still would be. My little book room would still be wall-to-wall books. But it's always been true that all the rest of my personal space is also filled with books. If that weren't true, would I feel different about myself? I don't know. That I need to think about these things more than I do, because it's not going to solve itself. I need to fix it one way or another. But anyway, a little bit of melodrama there to end out the personal library tag. I'm not going to tag anybody. because I've been seeing this tag go the rounds. But if you haven't done it, I very much want to hear about your personal library and what you think about all the issues that are raised here. Deeply, directly affects all of us on BookTube. So, anyway, this has gone on quite long enough. I'm going to wrap up this tag, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.